Minister, when did EU leaders lose their humanity? At what precise moment? Was it when Israel cut off supplies of water, food, medicine and fuel to 2.3 million people in Gaza and no one shouted stop? Was it when more than 5,000 children were slaughtered and no one shouted stop? Was it when the fuel ran out and incubators keeping premature babies alive were turned off and no one shouted stop? Was it on Friday when the death toll reached more than 11,000 and no one shouted stop? Or was it at the weekend when they had to stop counting the bodies and still no one shouted stop? Minister, ordinarily I'm proud to be part of Europe. I'm a supporter of the European project. I believe in its aims of peace, justice, security and prosperity. I also believe in its values. Those values are human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and human rights. European leaders claim to believe in these values and are tasked with prioritising and protecting them. They travel the world to autocratic and authoritarian regimes and urge them to adopt those very values. But their response to Gaza has highlighted the hypocrisy of their moralising. Today, those values feel like a slogan, a marketing blurb. It doesn't seem like they mean anything or have any power. How else can we explain the EU's despicable response to the slaughter in Gaza? More than 5 weeks of carnage and still no unified call for a ceasefire. As recently as Sunday, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs released a statement which could only call for a humanitarian pause of slaughter and contained no criticism of Israel for its savagery. The official EU position is now that we want a pause in the bombing for a few hours and then the ethnic cleansing can continue. I reject this statement. The EU leaders who wrote it are cowards and their position is indefensible. The High Representative for Foreign Affairs in his statement also urged Israel to exercise maximum restraint. Does he watch the news? Does he know what's going on? A child in Gaza is killed every 10 minutes, more than 100 UN aid workers massacred, more than 40 journalists deliberately assassinated, many of them targeted in their homes, and their entire families wiped out as collateral damage. Does this sound like restraint? Does this sound like proportionate? Does it sound legal? Because it's not. We have war crimes heaped upon war crimes in Gaza, like the bodies that are piling up outside the hospitals. It now seems clear that those European values cannot be found in leaders in Brussels or indeed in the UK or the United States. Instead, we are seeing those values of humanity, dignity, peace and equality in the medics who remain in Gaza, refusing to leave their patients, even if their own life is in danger. Their bravery, compassion, generosity and humanity is unparalleled. By Monday, at least 160 medical workers had been killed in nearly 140 Israeli attacks on healthcare facilities in Gaza. I want to specifically name one of those medics. Dr. Haman Alo was Gaza's only nephrologist. He was not killed at Shifa Hospital where he worked. He was murdered in an Israeli strike on his home, along with his father on Saturday. Dr. Alo had done several interviews with Western media. In his last interview, he was asked why he didn't leave Gaza for his own protection, and he became emotional. He said, "And if I go, who treats my patients? We are not animals. We have the right to receive proper health care. You think I went to medical school only to think about my life and not my patients? This is not the reason I became a doctor." The West is complicit in Dr. Alo's murder. He leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. The refusal of most Western leaders to shout stop and demand a ceasefire has led to thousands of deaths. Israel is killing with impunity. According to the World Health Organization, Gaza is now a graveyard for children. Minister, more children died in Gaza in just the first 3 weeks of this onslaught than those killed in every global conflict since 2019. Every day, 180 women in Gaza give birth, 15% of whom will experience complications and need medical care that is currently unavailable. According to UNICEF, 1 million children don't have access to enough clean water. The lack of basic medical supplies means that medics are performing amputations on children without anaesthetic. Think about that. A child having a foot amputated without anaesthetic, while just 20 kilometres away in Ashkelon, people visit beachfront cafes and attend nightclubs. It's actually difficult to comprehend. Minister, I recognise that the Irish government has done more than most in the EU to advocate for a ceasefire, but that's just evidence of how low the bar is. Words of condemnation are not enough. We need action. There must be consequences for the crimes perpetrated by Israel on a captive civilian population in Gaza. This cannot be allowed to go on. The trade deal between the EU and Israel has a human rights clause, which means that respect for human rights is supposed to form the bedrock of the deal. The Social Democrats aren't the only one who believe this clause should be triggered and the trade deal should be suspended. The Belgian Deputy Prime Minister, Petra de Sutter, and 30 MEPs, including Fianna Fáil MEP Barry Andrews, have advocated for the same thing. We are asking the Irish Government to work with like-minded EU leaders and MEPs to advocate for this. Because Europe is Israel's biggest trading partner, economic sanctions would hurt. The Taoiseach told me this wasn't an option because people in the EU differ. So it wasn't possible to even contemplate a suspension of the deal. I'd like to remind him that the deal is a legal contract with a clear and unambiguous clause that mandates the defence of human rights. That is not a subjective opinion. It is a legal obligation, it is a part of a trade deal, and it must be enforced. Israel also has access to a €95 billion EU fund called Horizon Europe for research and development. Access to that lucrative funding stream should be suspended on similar terms. There are measures we can take in this country too. The diplomatic status of the Israeli ambassador should be withdrawn. Minister, we do not suggest this lightly, but given Israel's deliberate targeting of civilians, journalists, UN staff and healthcare workers in Gaza, we believe it is necessary. I also should point out that this is a measure that nearly 50 government TDs, including former Foreign Affairs Minister Charlie Flanagan and Minister of State Neil Richmond and Jennifer Carr McNeill, all advocated for when it came to the Russian ambassador last year. At the time, Fianna Fáil TD Jim O'Callaghan stated, "We are a state that has a proud record of standing up to aggression and standing up for justice. That is why I find it so hard to understand that a country that is so proud like Ireland is prepared to associate itself diplomatically with a regime that is at present committing war crimes." I agree. The Irish government should also refer Israel to the International Criminal Court for investigation for war crimes. Yesterday, a Minister of State claimed doing this politicises the court. What nonsense. The existing inquiry has been stalled since 2021 because it has not been prioritised and has been starved of political support. Contrast that with the political muscle that was flexed last year when Ireland joined with 42 other states to make a referral to the courts about Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. ActionAid have urged the government to make a referral to show the prosecutor that there is support behind his work. We must also enact the Occupied Territories Bill and the Illegal Israeli Settlement Bill as a matter of urgency. The Irish people are repulsed at the slaughter in Gaza and they want us to do whatever we can nationally and internationally to end it. However, this government has decided to amend the motion and replace the diplomatic and economic sanctions we've proposed with platitudes and zero actions. Ireland has long been proud of a reputation as a voice for peace on the international stage, as a country who values human rights and international law and advocates for nations and people who face oppression. Ireland hasn't been found wanting when it comes to words of support for the Palestinian people, but in the face of an impending genocide, Minister, words are not enough. We must take action now, before it is too late.
Deputy Holly Cairns, please.
Firstly, I'd like to join other deputies in expressing sympathies to the families of all those who have passed during this pandemic and in paying tribute to all the essential workers. Compared with education, health or housing, food is rarely thought of as an area of public policy, but it is. It has taken a crisis for many people to realise how important our food producers and retail workers are. This crisis has forced us to ask, where does our food come from? And it has exposed our vulnerability in terms of food security. The flour shortage became a bit of a joke for some people looking to bake their way through the crisis, but it just shows that for many, it's coming as a surprise to learn just how much we rely on imports for basics, like flour, fruit and veg. Even the majority of our potatoes come from abroad. When we rely so heavily on imports, we leave ourselves exposed to disruptions that are completely out of our hands. Disruptions like this one, or Brexit. The Food and Agriculture Organisation of the UN has warned of disruptions to supply chains. Closer to home, the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association have pointed to our flour shortage. And a fresh outbreak of avian flu is currently causing an egg shortage. We've also seen the impact that panic buying and stocking up is having on food banks. The Committee on World Food Security has stressed the importance of strengthening government management of food markets. Yet in many areas, Ireland is a net importer of food. CSO figures show that we import more seafood, milk, cereals, vegetables and fruit than we export. Government needs to take an active role in transforming our agriculture sector to ensure it's both balanced and capable of producing the food we need. This emergency and future ones demands that food systems move towards a more self-sufficient model. Small change is not enough. It's time for transformative change, for systematic change. I know it won't be easy. I know our food system is so complicated, as is the global one that it's a part of, with competing priorities: consumer preferences, carbon footprint, animal welfare, economics, biodiversity. There are inevitable conflicts there. But what lessons can we learn from this? If we knew this crisis was 5 years away, how would we have better prepared for it? What we grow and eat are the result of our political choices. We know that unfortunately there will be more hard times like this. Brexit, the climate and biodiversity crisis. The bottom line is families need access to healthy and affordable, balanced diets, and farmers and other producers need to be able to earn a living. With this in mind, I want to ask the Minister what plans the Department will put in place to prepare for future potential disruptions to international food supply chains and to end the country's reliance on imported fresh produce. What steps will the Minister take to expand our capacity to produce our own fruit and vegetables instead of importing produce that could be grown here? Throughout this crisis, we've heard politicians referring to taking expert advice, something I think we all agree is a great call, but not just during a pandemic. When we talk about achieving a balance between a fair price for food producers, a fair wage for people who work in the food industry, and a fair price for consumers, experts have advised that where possible, shortening the supply chain between producers and consumer is vital, which is why I, like many others, was shocked at the closure of farmers' markets. Just like supermarkets, they are essential food retail outlets. After I drew attention to this, people have been in touch with me from across Cork, Waterford, Limerick and beyond seeking their immediate reopening. Thriving markets in West Cork and nationwide create supply chains that help us secure our food sovereignty and attract thousands of tourists. Many market traders are small-scale producers with extremely tight operating margins who rely on the markets with direct access to customers, taking out the so-called middleman. Before closure, markets showed great ingenuity in enabling social distancing and responsible transactions. Initiatives like Neighbour Food have helped connect consumers and producers during this time, but what rural communities really need is the return to weekly markets. Bearing all this in mind, I'm asking the Minister to ensure that farmers' markets will be allowed to reopen as soon as possible as forms of essential retail outlets, and similarly to everybody here today, to enable allotments to reopen at the same time as sources of small-scale food production. Respecting workers is something else that's come up. It's fundamental to a sustainable food model. In the recent Keelings controversy, the media focused on the spread of the coronavirus, but the incident highlights a broader issue within the food industry: the treatment of workers. Although the jobs were advertised, it was not economically viable, it seems, for local people to take them. This is typical of the sector. Ireland, like the UK and other countries, relies on international, seasonal and temporary workers who are often treated poorly. This situation is even worse in the developing world, where agricultural workers are subjected to horrendous abuse and exploitation. We need an agri-food system that can support families and communities not only in West Cork and Ireland, but also globally. I have two questions on this. To give us all confidence that the food we consume originates from a fair and just system, can you, Minister, instruct the Department to play a more active role in ensuring the food produced in Ireland and imported here has been produced ethically? And bearing in mind that tomorrow is Workers' Day, what measures are in place nationally and on a European level to ensure the protection of the rights of workers, whether they are permanent, temporary or migrant during the COVID-19 emergency? Thank you.
Minister.
I think when we talk about food security, it's important to remember that whilst we do import substantial volume and value of food, we are a very significant exporter of food to over 180 different countries around the world. Our exports in 2019 were valued in excess of 14 billion and sustained employment for over 170,000 people. So there is a global complexity to the food market which you allude to, and I accept, that shorter food supply chains are something that consumers are interested in. But we have certain global advantages in terms of our capacity to produce certain foods, and I don't think that they are incompatible with each other. And farmers' markets, the organic sector, allotments are all part of that milieu that is involved in the shorter food supply chains, and there's a role for that. But I mean, in terms of, say, the value of the organic sector relative to the value of the agri-food industry, it's minuscule, and not everybody will become organic, and not everybody can afford the premium associated with it. So I think there's a role for both, and we support, for example, in terms of our horticultural sector, we have a support scheme in 2020, which I think is in the order of €6 million available to the horticultural sector. Now, they will grow the products that it's commercially viable for them to grow. Some things it is cheaper to import, and that's the realities of the marketplace. We can't force people to engage in enterprises where they will not make an economic return from them. And as I said, we do support the horticulture sector. On your question of the ethics of production systems, we have laws here in respect of minimum wage, for example, and all employees are protected by that minimum wage. And in fact, it is one of the highest, if not the highest, minimum wage levels in the European Union. So in terms of workers' rights, that is a fundamental protection for workers. And many pay more than that. Many provide accommodation as well as the minimum wage and higher for their employees. So I would be kind of concerned if the impression went out there that this is an exploitative industry that is without any reference to the legal framework that it has to operate within. And I have no evidence to suggest that, and I think it would be wrong to kind of create an impression that we're dealing with a sector that's indifferent to ethics or workers' rights, etc. Obviously, we operate in the European Union context in terms of ethics in a broader sense, in terms of animal welfare, etc. And we have, in fact, for example, in an issue which attracts a lot of concern, for example, live exports, we have a legal framework that is, in fact, higher than the minimum requirements in terms of live exports that the European Union requires. So we're very conscious of our obligations in that regard and of our customers' concerns in that regard. So we, as I said, operate to EU standards plus in that area. But in the context of food security, there's no room for vigilance, and I've often made the point across the European Union that, for example, given the challenges around the age profile of agriculture, we really are an ageing workforce across the European Union. It's a big challenge, and there's a real danger if we don't attract new blood into the industry that we could run off a cliff in terms of our food security. We are, as an island nation, one of the most food secure countries on earth. I think, if not jointly with Canada, I think we're joint first. So But there's no room for complacency here. We have an age profile problem in agriculture, as they have across the world, in fact, not just in the European Union. So there's nothing to be taken for granted here. And in terms of the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, it is one of the areas that we need to be careful about, not just seducing young people into a career in agriculture, but making sure that if we attract young people into it, that we can give them a security in terms of an income that they can earn comparable with what their peers earn.
The time is up, Minister. Thank you. We move on to...
I want to start by acknowledging the sad death of Shane MacGowan. His legacy of iconic music is a testament to his genius, and on behalf of the Social Democrats I want to offer my condolences to his family, his friends and all who loved him. Taoiseach, I'm wondering, how high is too high? How high will rents have to go before your government says enough and actually does something about them? We have another report out today detailing sky-high rents. This time it's from the RTB. Rents for new tenancies are up an enormous 11.6%. Across the country, that means an average rent of €1,574 per month. Just 3 years ago, when you entered government, average rents were €1,226. Taoiseach, that's an increase of nearly €350 per month since you took office. This is the price of a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Green Party government to renters out there. An extra €4,200 per year going to their landlords since you took office. Taoiseach, do you know how difficult it is for students, workers and families to scrape together an extra €4,200 per year? Do you know that families go without proper meals, without heating, without warm coats in the winter, just to pay their rent? Do you know how hopeless and trapped people feel because they can't afford to move out of their childhood bedroom? Do you know how difficult it is to save for a house when almost all of your income is going towards your soaring rent? If you know all of this, then why won't you do anything about it? Why do you continue to gaslight the nation and come in here and tell us that this failure is somehow a success? I can guess one of the things you might say, Taoiseach. You'll say rent increases for existing tenants are lower, but their rents went up by 5.3% and average rents are €1,332. So what you should acknowledge is that those figures are just more evidence that the rental market is broken. The maximum rent increase in rent pressure zones is supposed to be 2%. Your minister brought that rule in. But clearly, landlords up and down the country are ignoring that upper threshold and charging whatever they like. And why wouldn't they? Your government has overseen tenancy laws that amount to zero rights for renters. For no reason at all, tenants can be evicted. Meanwhile, the regulator, the RTB, is not so much toothless as comatose. It either doesn't have the power, the resources, or the interest to pursue landlords who breach the regulations. Taoiseach, I've listened to members of your government make earnest promises on housing for years. You say it's your top priority, but every year the crisis gets worse. Rents become even more unaffordable. The prospect of owning a home gets more out of reach, and record number of people are homelessness. We're all tired of these broken promises. Taoiseach, it's time for action. Will you freeze rents for 3 years, introduce a ban on no-fault evictions, and introduce a rent register so there's some transparency around rents?
Taoiseach, please.
Again, Deputy, we all recognise, and I've said it already, that housing is the most significant social issue we face in this country. But I'm interested in coming up with solutions. I've heard very little, precious little from you, other than a good descriptive analysis of the current situation, but actually no solutions. And freezing rent is not a solution. It is not a solution because it would cause a further exodus from the rental market, which would reduce supply and would result in ever-increasing rental prices. And that is the reality. Supply has to be the solution here. And we have a range of schemes that we've developed to increase housing supply. And we've brought in the tax credit to help people to alleviate the pressures of increasing rents. And we have strengthened very significantly the powers of the RTB. It's not fair or accurate to say that nothing has been done in terms of regulation in respect of the rental situation. The RPZs themselves, you've mentioned the rent pressure zones. 75% are now covered by rent pressure zones. Now this RTB index does not capture compliance, and it's not as simple as you've articulated in terms of breaches of the 2% or not. But there are sanctions, and there are significant resources have been allocated to the RTB in respect of that issue. But an ESRI study of the RPZs with the Department of Housing have said that if it wasn't for the RPZs and the zoning, the inflation in house rent would be notably higher. So they are impactful, and they are, notwithstanding the very high levels of rent across the country, which is a function of supply. And in the last 3 years alone, since this government came in, about 100,000 new homes will be delivered. We had COVID-19, which did impact initially in the first year and a half of government in terms of house construction. But we have, and we've also brought in the tenant in situ scheme, with about 2,500 sales now being progressed on that scheme alone. We've brought in the cost rental, which is rents are 25% below the market level, and up to quite a substantial number of cost rental homes have been made available. That's a whole new form of tenure, and we're going to drive that on in the months to come. So there's been a very wide-ranging number of schemes to get housing supply up, and ultimately that is key. And I would argue, by the way, that over the last 3 years, a lot of the negativity around the rental market and proposals for freezing and so on like that has had a negative impact on supply. And that is an issue that we need to focus on. How do we get more houses into the market, into the rental market in particular, so that we can get supply down and get the rents, at least the rate of increase down, and develop schemes as we have in terms of social housing and in terms of the cost rental, that we can give options to people for much lower rents than currently is the case.
Deputy Cairns.
Well, so listening to you, you'd swear that this is some kind of big conspiracy to make Fianna Fáil and the government look bad when they're doing everything that they can. But if it is, I'm afraid that the RTB, the ERSI, and loads more are in it with me. You may not want to admit it, but the facts are the facts. And the facts are that rents in this country under your watch are a runaway train. And you keep coming in here and telling us that everything's under control. But every year it gets worse. The housing crisis has become a housing disaster. At what point will you actually just admit that your approach is not working? Because people out there can't afford any more of these mistakes. Since you came into office in 2020, you've cost renters an additional $4,200 a year. How much more will people have to pay for this failure and this denial? You say housing is the biggest social issue that we face. I agree with you. Why don't you act like it and do something about it? You're constantly asking for solutions. I know there are bigger solutions around supply. All of those things are absolutely necessary, and I'm not disregarding them, but given the consistent rising figures in homelessness, will you introduce a rent freeze, bring back the ban on no-fault evictions, and introduce a rent register so renters at least know if they're being ripped off?
First of all, Deputy, I think there's a huge dearth of proposals and solutions from you and your party in respect to housing. I don't see any detailed proposals over and above what's in housing for all the government's comprehensive housing plan in terms of increasing supply. You've made a passing reference in your question there to, yeah, you do accept that there's higher, bigger need for housing supply. Housing supply is the key. And I think some of the policies that you've put forward in terms of banning and freezing would actually reduce supply and would have a very negative impact on the rental market. And that would mean higher prices again. And I do have to challenge that simplistic notion that we can simply ban everything for 3 years and everything will be the same, or that it'll get better. If you ban anything for 3 years, people will get out of the market and do other things. We've seen that. And we've tried to clamp down on some of that in terms of Airbnb and so on like that, and provide for planning permissions so as to try and keep a higher number of houses in the rental market so that we can try and keep a downward pressure on prices. But the way I would respectfully suggest that you're directing policy or suggesting policy should go would actually reduce supply and increase prices even more.
Deputy Dennis Naughton.
First of all, I'd like to say how grateful I am to the people of Cork South West and what an honour it is to represent them here. Brexit-related uncertainty might be front of mind since the European Council meeting, but it's fair to say that a reduction in cap payments has been on the card since the Commission put forward its original budget proposal in May 2018. At the very heart of this new arrangement discussed in February is the Irish Protocol, which appears to guarantee unfettered trade north to south and vice versa on the island of Ireland. Of course, the question is, will this measure stay in place regardless of whatever future trade arrangements are agreed between the UK and the EU? From an agricultural perspective, this means looking at issues that could de-harmonise agri-trade arrangements on this island. And the most obvious one that springs to mind is a distortion in support measures between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Given the dependence of Irish farm incomes on cap payments, there is an inevitably concern over what future negotiations could mean for cap payments to Irish farmers, and any disparity and unfair advantage arising on the island. We know that in recent weeks the Westminster Government committed to retaining its farm funding at 2019 levels for the next 5 years. This of course includes Northern Ireland, where the new Minister for Agriculture has already confirmed the farm support budget for 2020. In the south, within this largely unchanged total, the Commission proposed to shift spending priorities away from the two big ticket items, cohesion and agriculture spending, towards other priorities. With respect to CAP, it proposed a reduction of 15% in constant 2018 prices. This was skewed in favour of a small cut to Pillar 1 spending of 11% and a much larger cut in Pillar 2 spending of 27%. In real terms, average direct payments would fall by 10 to 11%, with a greater cut of 25% in rural development spending. The cuts are less significant in nominal terms. Farmers would see an average of a 3% cut to the nominal amount of their direct payments, while nominal spending on rural development would be cut by 12%. There has never been any attempt or commitment to inflation-proof these payments. From this perspective, a 3 to 4% cut in nominal direct payment may sound small, but it will have a big impact on smaller family farms, already struggling to make ends meet. Although in itself won't be a decisive factor in the future of farming, what will be a decisive factor in the future of farming is the climate and biodiversity crisis. I'm honoured to be agriculture spokesperson for the Social Democrats. I was advised not to touch this brief with a barge pole by family and friends because it's seen as a lose-lose role. To date, all we see and hear is farmers pitted against environmentalists. The conclusion is you're always going to offend someone. But as a West Cork farmer, I believe changing the narrative is an important place to start. That we have to be able to have a productive conversation, no matter how controversial or emotive the issue can be. And I think it's fair to say that CAP, and more specifically CAP reform, can be an emotive topic. There's a good reason for that, because as payment systems go, CAP often raises more issues than it solves. There are many among us in the farming community who don't believe it's fair that a small number of farms are able to take the lion's share of payments when we have smaller family farmers at factory gates length and breadth of the country because they can't get a fair price for their hard work. And more farmers are still left wondering why we're now being blamed for the climate change crisis, for practices that we were actively encouraged and financially incentivised to engage in. Yes, the climate and biodiversity crises are real, but it's not outlandish to suggest that both of these things have ironically been taxpayer funded through CAP. This is not a personal failure of farmers, it's a systematic failure, it's a policy one. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, a department official came out to my farm and docked me €800 off my area aid payment because I had bushes encroaching on fields. So in other words, I was financially incentivised to damage the biodiversity on my own farm. I'm a farmer, but I'm also a scientist, and I believe it's time to change the way we talk about farming in this country. Instead of viewing farmers as the problem, we need to start realising that they are the solution, and I include farmers themselves in that, because we have to change. This is what succession planning looks like in 2020. It's what succession planning looks like in the face of our climate and biodiversity crisis, because if we want the next generation to stay on the land, we have to give them a reason to stay. We have to allow them to make a reasonable, fair living for what we'd all agree is extremely hard work. What if we paid our farmers to take care of the landscapes the future of the industry depends on, instead of incentivising them to industrialise it? What if we paid and supported them in moving away from practices we now know are destructive, and helped them open up new opportunities that will come with the changes we need to make? I'd rather see CAP reform that supported farmers and protects the sector in a sustainable way, not a system that forces us into intensified production and depends on overconsumption to survive, and sits back while farmers take the blame for the inevitable results we're now facing. As smaller farmers have seen all too clearly over the past 12 months, they're likely to be swallowed up by that system. Yet all we ever seem to hear from the Department of Agriculture is defence of the sector's growth targets. They quote old data that tells us we do things in some kind of magic formula in Ireland that means it's all right for us to release greenhouse gas emissions because if we don't, another country will. There's no sustainability in that. More recent data from the UN tells us that we release more carbon per euro of food produced than any other country in Europe. There's no sustainability in that. We say things like we need to feed the millions around the world, but we're already a net calorie importer. We decry the burning of the Amazon to clear land for cattle, and then we import feed from there, grown on that cleared land for our own cattle. There's no sustainability in that. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization have warned that the world depends on topsoil to grow 95% of its food, but that's rapidly disappearing under the strain of intensive production. If we continue to degrade our topsoil at the rate we are now, we could run out within 60 years. Imagine 60 harvests of food left. There's no sustainability in that. Our sector is vulnerable, yes. We all know about the small number of very wealthy businesses, but for the overwhelming majority of us, farming is not a lucrative business. But it plays an extremely valuable role in our rural towns and communities, and CAP plays an extremely valuable role in sustaining those family farms and food producers. A representative from a farming organisation told me earlier this week that talk of sustainability in Irish farming was airy-fairy. I can't agree. Sustainability is making sure there's something to farm tomorrow. Sustainability is making sure your kids will also be able to earn a living on the land. Sustainability is producing an exceptional, high-quality product that people pay for and value precisely because it's the product of a truly sustainable system. It's time to view CAP reform through this lens and support farmers through the changes we need to make. Thank you. Taoiseach, Neasa Horrigan said that the Green Party values were not represented when the coalition leaders agreed to lift the eviction ban. Can I ask, were Fianna Fáil values represented in the room when you took that decision? I know this may seem like a redundant question, given that the Minister for Housing is a member of Fianna Fáil, but I think people, including your own supporters, would like to know. How is it that Fianna Fáil, which is rightly proud of its previous record on housing generations between the 1930s and 70s, is now endorsing homelessness, not housing? Your own Minister, Darragh O'Brien, has been clear. Homelessness will increase as a result of this decision. There is no debate about that. We know the consequence will be desperate, particularly for children who suffer long-lasting damage when they become trapped in insecure and unsuitable emergency accommodation. That's why, Taoiseach, it's important to remember that what you are doing is a choice. You're not being forced to do this. There are other options. I've listened to the attempts to justify this shameful decision with an increasing sense of disgust and utter disbelief. Who do you think you're kidding? The half-baked plans that you've announced, which you claim will support tenants and landlords, won't be in place for many months. And that's an optimistic appraisal. For one, we're told landlords will be compelled to give their tenants first refusal when they sell. Yet no one in government can tell us when that legislation will be enacted or even drafted. Secondly, approved housing bodies, we are told, will be able to craft bespoke cost rental agreements for tenants at risk of homelessness. Again, no one knows when this will be up and running. It's also unclear why, if you wanted to introduce these supports, they're not ready to go. What were you doing for the duration of the eviction ban? Why were the draft outlines of these supports only cobbled together at the Cabinet meeting on Tuesday? The lack of respect for those people about to become homeless is truly astounding. You have clearly done zero planning for this. You are making it up as you go along. Taoiseach, thousands of people, including extremely vulnerable children, are going to be made homeless in 3 short weeks. They don't know where they're going to go, neither do you. Taoiseach, I have just 2 questions. Were Fianna Fáil values represented in the room when you decided to end the eviction ban? Are you aware of any other housing minister in the history of the state who has openly admitted to deliberately opting to make people homeless.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate the Deputy on your elevation as leader of the Social Democrats. I didn't get the opportunity in the House to do so to date, and I wish you the very best in that respect. And could I say, in terms of Fianna Fáil values, I think Fianna Fáil values were reflected when we decided to form the government to take on the housing portfolio, notwithstanding the challenges that had built up over the years, and to make a real difference. And that difference is manifest already in the fact that last year, over 10,000, close to 10,000 social homes were delivered. That's the highest since 1975. And I made it a priority that we would build social houses. And we are turning the corner in terms of social housing, the highest since 1975. And this year, through a combination of new build, leasing and acquisitions, we target 12,000 social houses to be delivered. But in addition to that, we have to help young people who value home ownership and who want to own their own homes through a variety of schemes that we've introduced, from the Affordable Housing Act, right through the Help to Buy, which was run by the previous government, the First Home Scheme. We've improved the Help to Buy scheme. 33,000 young people have benefited from the Help to Buy scheme. Over 1,100 people have benefited from the First Home Scheme. And I point out that your party opposed both schemes. Your party opposed the Affordable Housing Act. And I think, fine, you can oppose, but you need to come up with real solutions, because ultimately the solution here is supply. No one in this House has a monopoly in terms of commitment to housing. No one has. Your party doesn't. And I think you should resist the temptation to suggest that everyone on this side of the House is heartless, cruel, and couldn't care less. That's unfair and doesn't add up. I've made housing the priority of this government, along with my colleagues in government. The three parties have said three key priorities: housing, health reform, climate change. You look at a variety of schemes that we introduced on housing. All new Creek Cona. We introduced a land development agency, which again you opposed. And I would simply say that by any yardstick, going from 20,000 houses to 30, it's all too low still, we still have to do more, is a significant turning of the corner last year, notwithstanding COVID-19 in the first 2 years of government, which we had lockdowns and so on. But and those are facts that you can't just dismiss. So in terms of then, to come to the point, the real decision, the popular decision would have been to keep it going, keep the rent ban eviction going. That would have been actually popular, and it would have been, but it would not have been a sustainable position to adopt in terms of the supply question. We would have made it worse for people who would come into further difficulty in terms of getting access to housing. That was the dilemma. People are not coming into the rental market.
Thank you, Taoiseach. The time is up.
And people are leaving the rental market.
Time is up, please.
The advice is very strong from those with a degree of experience and expertise in the housing market,
please,
that if you do this, you will damage and undermine prospects of people to get homes into the future.
Deputy Cairns.
Taoiseach, I don't think that I should need to remind you that you're in government, not the Social Democrats. And you talk about the things that we oppose. Imagine if we'd supported the government's decisions on housing. That's what's led us here. We oppose your decisions because we think that they're wrong. And it's not about what we think. The evidence is in the number of people who are homeless. 12,000 people homeless. And we're looking at, in 3 weeks' time, an additional 3,000 homes being homeless. We don't know how many people that is. We don't know how many children it is. We're not trying to hide the fact that we oppose your suggested legislation on housing because it's not working. And this decision will make it worse, not better. I'm asking if your values, traditionally, are represented in the decision to end an eviction ban in the middle of a housing crisis when all of the measures that you're saying will help the situation have yet to be even ironed out. We don't even know when they'll be introduced. The way you're explaining them as if they would work would be if they were going to be introduced before the ban is lifted. And that hasn't happened. It's clear to everybody. You're making it up as you go along. Will you please consider reversing this decision before 3,000 more households are actually forced into homelessness?
Thank you, Deputy Cairns.
Sorry, it was this government introduced the eviction ban. This government introduced the eviction ban.
And what's
the first time in the history of the state. Everybody in this House says it should be temporary, to one degree or another. All of you do. So there's terrible hypocrisy in the debate, because Sinn Féin says we should lift it at Christmas time, a couple of days after Christmas Day. That's the stated position of Sinn Féin. And how dishonest is it? The deputy has made the point that, I don't want to paraphrase, you more or less said it doesn't matter what we say. Of course it does. Like there's an obligation on everyone in the House. If you oppose, come up with solutions. Come up with ideas.
We do.
But you don't.
You vote them all down.
And also I make the point that I don't understand how you can say that the Help to Buy scheme, which helps 33,000 young purchasers, and you just dismiss that and you oppose it. It helps the young people to get an access to buy a house. And they get into a house. Now, maybe you're against home ownership, I don't know, if that's your position. But I would make the point on the leasing, the 1,000 leasing, the 1,000 from the adjustment to CAV funding, and also the 1,000, the 1,500 in respect of the in situ policy, basically saying to the local authorities that if someone is in threat of homelessness now, we're saying to local authorities, buy the house. And that would go as a directive and a circular to local authorities. That's the immediate response.